Okay, thank you, Favonia. Um, Hopefully my slides are showing up. So yeah, I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I had wanted to, since I'm at Northeastern now, I'm local and would really love to meet all of you and talk to you in person. But unfortunately, I'm still testing positive for COVID. Feeling a little symptomatic today as well, so my energy levels may not be quite up to where I want them to be for a talk. I hope you'll understand. Uh, but nonetheless, I thought it was really important to come and share some of this, and yeah, I hope it's helpful to some of you. So this talk is titled "Anti-disciplinary: Navigating Academia When You Like Too Many Things." The URL for the slides will be at the bottom of the rest of the slides if you'd like to access them and follow along. So as Favonia pointed out, I'm an associate professor at Northeastern, and I have a 50-50 joint appointment between two colleges/departments. The Corey College of Computer Sciences, which I think in the last few years has gone completely departmentless. So it's just a massive pile of computer science and computer science adjacent people. And the College of Arts, Media, and Design, specifically the Art and Design department within that college. I'm new to Northeastern. I moved here to Boston last summer from North Carolina State. My pronouns are they, them, and well, roughly speaking, my research interests span various sub-areas of programming languages and human-computer interaction, including functional and logic programming, which is kind of the world that I grew up with, type theory and proof assistance. By grew up with, I don't mean as a child, like in college and grad school. And then in HCI, those interests include digital games, narrative, cognitive science, and generative art. And well, getting into some of the specifics about how these things connect to each other is more or less what this talk is about. So I'd like to know a little bit about folks in the room, especially since I'm not actually there to see you. If any of you have access to the chat, please share this information. I guess not everybody, the people who are there physically in the room don't necessarily have access to the chat, but if you do, I would love to know this information about you. Sort of what, just the general sort of like who's a PhD student, who's an undergrad, what are your research interests, that kind of thing. Actually, is there any way that I can see the audience in the room that like the camera could point that direction by chance? Just so I can ask the questions where I can get like a show of hands about things. Is that possible? Yeah, okay. You're still a very small square, but I can see you. Yay. All right, excellent. Let's go with that. Hi, I see you waving. Okay, so yeah, so let's do a couple of these questions. So I guess first let me start with a couple of things on the previous slide. So raise your hand if you're a current PhD student. Awesome. Put your hand down. Raise your hand if you are a current bachelor's student or undergraduate degree. Few people. Put your hands down. Is anybody in neither of those camps, either master's or industry? Handful of people as well. Okay, awesome. And then, okay, so moving on to what's actually on the slide. Raise your hand if this is your first conference. So many people. That's awesome. Yay, welcome. I hope it's a good experience. Raise your hand if you're giving a talk at this conference. Maybe some of you are. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Very cool. Great to see. And for those of you who are giving a talk, are you giving a talk for the first time? I guess if it's your first conference, it probably is, yeah. And all right, now this is a little bit more vulnerable, but if you, particularly if you are giving a talk or if it's your first conference, if you feel at all overwhelmed or socially anxious about it, raise your hand. Okay. Look around the room and just note that you're not alone in that feeling. Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, so I want to briefly, respond to that last point about feeling overwhelmed. It's a new kind of social situation. you probably have a lot of expectations that either you yourself are putting on yourself or that maybe your advisor is putting on you about kind of how to do conferences and how to get the most out of them, that kind of thing. My reframing, at least for the moment, is to present you with this relatively serene picture I took of Boston several years ago, and just remind you that you're in a beautiful city with lots of like-minded nerds. It's a kind of special thing, and there are going to be some scary things about it, but I think that there are also going to be some really joyful things about it. And I encourage you to follow your joy and to remember to tune back into what you're experiencing and what you want to get out of this. And uh, whenever you're feeling a little bit too overwhelmed, just try to figure out what is it that's exciting to me about being in Boston with a bunch of like-minded nerds. Who do I want to talk to? What kind of conversations do I want to have? Or do I just need some downtime, which you almost certainly will. You can't do 3 or 4 consecutive days of conferencing without some breaks. So definitely try to pay attention to what you need, and rest when you need it, whether that means going for a walk outside, or just going back to your hotel room. Just take some downtime. That's totally fine. I did that a lot as a grad student. I still do it a lot as a professor. So I want to tell you a little bit about my path, and I'll start by mentioning that at ICFP 2017 in Oxford, I was invited to keynote the main conference, which was really exciting to me. And because I was going to be there anyway, they also brought me in to do a talk for PLMW there. And this talk is basically an adaptation to that, but it's really a follow-up because at the time the title was doing a PhD when you like too many things. I was relatively close to having finished. I was not too long after having finished my PhD at that point. And so that experience was still fresh on my mind. But now I've got a little bit more to extend the story with. So yeah, at the time I was an assistant professor at NC State, just in the computer science department, trying to really frame my research as specifically like squarely within the field of computer science, convince everybody in my department, like, yes, this is a real, the work that I do is real, like games are computer science, and that's why you should care about it. And ultimately, this arose from a lot of insecurity, right? I was still kind of unsure whether I could hack it as an academic, whether it was for me. I hadn't yet secured funding. I was worried about whether anybody would fund my work. So it was coming from a little bit of a place of insecurity. And to be clear, I'm a fan of like explicitly talking about those times that we do feel insecure. I think it's really important to be open about that with each other when it's safe to do so, at least, because that's gonna help remind each other that we're our support group. That we support each other, and that that's an important role that we play. It's more important than competing with each other for accolades. Also importantly, at the time, I was not yet out to myself as trans and not yet aware that I had ADHD. So that will come back in this story. But let's back up for a moment and let me start kind of where I started in that talk with my excuse me, with my path through research. So I was an undergraduate student in computer science at CMU. I did a bachelor's thesis on logical frameworks. Basically, all of my interests were deeply theoretical and rooted in functional programming and logic and proofs. And I had no interest at all in doing anything practical. So I kind of figured there's no real place for me in industry, and it was 2008, so the economy was a mess, and it just seemed like grad school was a good decision anyway. So I stayed at CMU for grad school. I entered the PhD programming and was basically like, yeah, I'm a strictly theoretical person. I don't want to do anything applied. And then I spent the first fragment of my time in grad school doing a huge proof in a proof assistant called 12th. Shout out to 12th. And if you know what 12th is, you're awesome. If you don't, I'd be happy to tell you. And in the meantime, and this maybe should have been a clue to me early on about a lot of things, but like I spent a lot of time like in grad school doing things that were not my research, taking figure drawing classes, drawing comics, mostly like travelogues and autobiographical comics, making games and interactive fiction, and sometimes like going to conferences about those things, all of which I felt like I had to keep secret from my advisors and from like anybody that I was talking to about research, because that's not relevant, right? This is the there's this pervasive belief in grad school, like in research in general, but in doing a PhD specifically, that you have to really be like single-mindedly obsessed with your research topic, and that anything else coming in from outside of that is a distraction. So I felt a little bit low-key like guilty about doing those things. And to be fair, I was honestly like, I had a lot of anxiety about my research and was probably anxiously avoiding it a lot of the time. But I also did not feel like I could be open about these other interests that I had. Um, then in 2013, something cool happened. A friend of mine sent me this paper and was just like, oh, this looks kind of interesting, like maybe relevant to your interests, by a French computer scientist, Antoine Bosser, who I didn't know at the time, but who, spoilers, has since become a mentor of mine, who helped my career a lot. And she wrote this paper called Linear Logic for Nonlinear Storytelling, which was about modeling certain forms of branching nonlinear narrative, that the kind of things you might see as like interactive fiction, using linear logic. And my reaction to this was just like stunned that people were doing research like this in the world and publishing about it, and that was even like a possible path that you could take. I did not have any idea. So this led me to coming up with my thesis topic, which I actually developed in collaboration with Anne Gwen. I got in touch with her, and we wrote a paper together, and I got a secondary advisor, and like all the pieces started kind of falling into place for me to do this work, which became my thesis, Programming Interactive World with Linear Logic. And I developed a linear logic programming language called Scepter to go alongside that. And it was great. I had a lot of fun doing it. I was able to focus on it for the duration that carried me through to my dissertation. Um, and yeah, because it was like intrinsically combining these things that I had intrinsic motivation to care about, that got me the rest of the way through the PhD. I also then started attending games conferences, things like AID, which is AI and Interactive Digital Entertainment, FDG, Foundations of Digital Games, and iKids, which is the International Conference on Interactive Digital Storytelling. Yes, I think I got all of those. And I found out about a lot of those venues through the interaction that I had with folks at UC Santa Cruz, because I did a postdoc. I sort of like had no idea how to go about getting a postdoc, but basically cold emailed some people whose work I thought looked interesting, and wound up getting this postdoc with the Expressive Intelligence Studio at UC Santa Cruz, and met a lot of really, really wonderful people who are now the core part of my academic community, I would say. Um, long story short, after that, I got a faculty job at NC State. Was really excited about that. Got to start my research lab, or my research group, which I called Principles of Expressive Machines. Secretly, a little bit of like a word level portmanteau of the Principles of Programming group at CMU, the POP group, and the Expressive Intelligence Studio at UC Santa Cruz. So just kind of trying to like merge those things together as I sort of thought through what my research interests were. And that at that point, I then did the keynote, and so now we're caught up to the little in media res starting point that I led with. And at the time, I was definitely still trying to figure out how to label my academic identity. So today, I'm at Northeastern. I negotiated for tenure on entry, so I've got tenure now, which is awesome. I'm part of 2 departments, which in some ways is more work, but in other ways, it's absolutely lovely. I am so thrilled to be a part of an art and design department and to get to know people working who've been like trained in those disciplines, and to see how they think about problems. Many of them the same problems that I've been thinking about in computer science communities, but from very different perspectives. And I'm really happy here. I also, at my time at NC State, got an NSF Career Award on basically this intersection of narrative and logic, so applying narrative generation and mechanized logical models to understanding things like privacy policies. I got some Air Force funding on a social simulation project that is still ongoing. And I've been working on, along the way, like a whole bunch of other projects that have had various sources of funding, and most recently, sort of some unfunded work on language design for procedural content generation and generative art, and narrative generation for helping tabletop role-playing game players do collaborative world building. So I've gotten to do a lot of really cool work. I have found funding, so I've been able to have students. It's great. I could not have imagined sort of a better outcome for that. So now I can finally get into starting to talk to you about like what my research interests are and why this has been so challenging for me for such a long time. This is a partial list of disciplines that have informed my research. I will not claim, of course, to be an expert in any of these things. These are not my core research field. These are just like things where I have read at least one book and periodically like look for research papers, right? That will then inform the approach that I take for the research problems that I solve. So this includes things like visual narrative theory. We can revisit my interest in comics to see that becomes relevant again in some of the work I've done in understanding visual narrative. Media literacy theory, including how we understand video games as procedures that respond to user input, which is, a lot of that work has been done by folks in the humanities. Cognitive science, because fundamentally a lot of what I'm doing is focusing on how humans interact with formal systems. Linguistics, so thinking about languages in the sense of programming languages, but also in the sense of the less formal languages with which all human-computer interactions take place. Mathematics, still, I think, is a huge source of insight for understanding repeating structures that occur in the formal design of all of these systems. Theater and performance arts, visual art movement, sociology and social science. Increasingly, things like design justice and participatory design methods, and critical race theory, queer theory, disability studies. All of this stuff has played some role for me. So if you want to know more about any of these, feel free to ask. But yeah, it's basically all the things. And that can be a challenge, right? That's this whole problem that I led with of like, if you're interested in all the things, you clearly don't have time to become an expert in everything. And you really do have to contribute deeply to some problem. But if you try to say, oh, my research interests are, and you give this big list, like most people will think you have a completely incoherent research program. So in search of a label, right? I've been trying, for the past however long, right, since the beginning of basically when I picked my thesis topic, I've been trying to figure out how to explain my research area to people in as succinct a way as possible. And so, because I started out in PL, my instinct was at first to say, well, programming languages, right? But that has some problems. So I don't really publish in PL venues these days. I don't think I really do the kind of work that POPL and ICFP values, which isn't to say that I don't value that work. I do value it. It's just that the type of work that I am best at doesn't necessarily involve like doing formal proofs every step of the way, right? Or like coming up with like actually inventing a novel program construct as opposed to demonstrating the use of an existing one, for example. I also, if I try to write papers like that, I find, I have to justify why I care so much about things like games, narrative, art, creativity, every step of the way, because by default, people look at those things as impractical and therefore not really worth doing research on, which is its own issue that I will touch on a little bit more. And in general, like the shape of these papers is very much expected to be the rhetorical shape, right, is like you come in with your paper and you say, here's a problem that hasn't been solved yet, and here's my solution. So it's structured as problem solution. Um, this is not the only way to write a paper, and I honestly had no idea about that until much, much later in my career, right? You don't like this is not just PL. I think most of computer science and like engineering based areas tend to have this approach of like we have to basically sell our idea as better than the competing ideas, and we have to show how it solves a certain problem better than some other, better than all of those other competing ideas. And yeah, that's just not the only way to write a paper, and a lot of my papers are not written that way anymore. And it doesn't, the sort of things that POPL and IDP values don't tend to leave a lot of room for the examination of the human experience, whether that's through a formal human subject study or even just sort of less formal discussion of design considerations that impact the human experience. So you might think, okay, well, HCI, right? Like that's a big umbrella, human computer interaction. And that's fundamentally what you're working on, right? And yeah, it kind of is. But I sometimes struggle to have productive conversations with HCI faculty and HCI researchers as well, because they often tend to reject, or at the very least be very suspicious of formalism. Anytime you kind of try to say like, well, what if like let's use a theorem prover, let's use a logical model, right? They just balk at you because they're like, what normal user could understand that? They just don't think it's possible, which is frustrating because I think it is. But then on the other, and there's a lot of points where we agree, but then they'll often say, well, okay, if you're right, then do a human subject study to prove it, and that's the kind of like the baseline method of evaluation, which again for me is not always, just as proofs are not always my best method of evaluation, neither are human subject studies. It also may be kind of too big of an umbrella. It's a little bit hard to sometimes define my people within the huge umbrella of people who call themselves HCI. In some ways, that's also a good thing, but yeah, it's a pretty big space. And then finally, AI, kind of from out of left field, right? The main conference I published at is called AI in Interactive Digital Entertainment, and it's under the AAAI umbrella. And I was a little confused by this when I first got into the world of kind of computer science-based games research, is that a lot of people were calling my work AI, like calling my work on logic programming AI, and I didn't understand why really. I mean, like I know that these things all have kind of a common origin. And actually, my talk on my keynote at ICFP 2017 is all about this, the kind of common origins of functional programming and artificial intelligence. But nowadays, it doesn't really work, I don't think, as a general descriptor for what I do, because most of the time people will just assume I'm talking about machine learning, particularly if you're talking to funders. And if you're not doing machine learning, they will wonder why not. And so that's its own problem, having to try to justify that. Okay. So yeah, so then I lit upon this term. Well, okay, maybe I don't need to have a disciplinary label per se. I can just call myself anti-disciplinary, which is sort of like a pun on interdisciplinary, but kind of rejecting the idea of disciplinary labels at all, talking about our interests while sort of avoiding a commitment to a specific disciplinary label. I got this phrase from Golan Levin at CMU, who probably got it from someone else. I honestly don't know its origin. This is a image of some of Golan's work. Golan is a computational media artist who does a lot of really cool stuff with computation and the visual arts. So at the time, he was one of the few people I knew who was kind of doing work in this intersection, and I liked the way that he talked about it. But these days, honestly, I'm kind of like just label fluid, which is to say, like, I explain my work differently to different audiences. So that's, not a perfect solution, but that's kind of the way it goes. But I'm pretty happy where I am, and things that have really helped me along the way include seeing people other than me out there in the world being successful and incorporating multiple disciplines, not just multiple like disciplinary topics, but also multiple methodologies into what they do, and specifically building computational systems, engaging in some kind of creative practice, and and then like analyzing and critiquing those systems as well, not just problem solving. Um, some of the people I'm really fortunate to have had as either collaborators or just people I've looked up to are named here. The links will go to their websites, and their photos are on the screen. And something that perhaps will catch your attention is that most of these people are not cis white men, if not all of them. And that was also really important for me, was to see spaces that were not just that didn't just include some not cis white men, but that were actually like majority not cis white men, was kind of inspiring to me. And they were almost always interdisciplinary spaces. That's just kind of, that seems to be how this works. Is that a lot of people who my colleague Belinda, who's the first picture here, had this theory that's stuck with me ever since she told it to me, which was like, people who are already on the margins already kind of have had to become comfortable with being outsiders and being thought of as outsiders. So it's not as big of a leap to engage in interdisciplinary work, because both of the disciplines, or all of the disciplines you engage with, are going to see you as an outsider, but that's not anything different. You're already an outsider. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a compelling theory. Another thing that helped me was reading books. There's a subselection on the screen, which I think are things that might specifically appeal to folks in this room or just who are interested in this talk. And I came across an excellent blog post by Amy Ko actually earlier today that I decided to include in this slide. Hopefully you can't hear my cats causing disaster in the background. It's fine. So Amy Ko has this post on Medium about how computer science taught me that books weren't important. It was wrong. And this article actually blew my mind because I read it and I so thoroughly recognized my own experience of like sort of being subtly culturally informed that books weren't important, but I had never actually explicitly recognized that that's what was happening. I'd heard people say things like, "Oh, you don't need to write a book to like get tenure as a computer scientist," but what I hadn't really realized was that there was more than that. It was really like people were devaluing books both as things you could produce as an academic and as things you should even engage with as a reader. It was all about reading papers, right? Never about reading books. And I think that's actually kind of a problem. Uh, for one thing, because books are the bread and butter of a lot of other disciplines. So if you want to get up to speed on how other disciplines think about problems, a lot of that is documented in book form. And second, because a book can really give you an end-to-end, thorough motivation and framing for a problem, and go into a lot more depth than a paper can. So if you're kind of like, well, I know that I should, or like I'm kind of interested in this problem, or I think maybe it's relevant to me, but I don't really know like what's the origin of how people are thinking about that problem. What does it relate to in the world? Like, yeah, maybe try reading a book. I know, mind-blowing advice. Okay. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but at the time, what I didn't really know. So therapy was super important for just helping get me through grad school, helped me figure out a lot of things. I think perhaps not more than the average grad student, but I certainly struggled with anxiety and depression throughout grad school. And largely, at this point, I basically attribute that not exactly as a misdiagnosis, but as identifying symptoms that were not the root cause, probably with ADHD as the root cause. I had a lot of, like, most of my depression came up because I felt unable to make progress with my work and focus on it. A lot of my anxiety was around how do I make progress with my work and focus on it. So getting an ADHD diagnosis as a professor was very, very useful to me in being able to find tools that could actually work and help me. And also hugely explanatory about my past experiences. Um, Gender transition was important too. I mean, it's hard to kind of extract these things and disentangle them and figure out what was what. But certainly, like, just having a stronger sense of self and knowing how I wanted to move in the world enabled me to have a lot more confidence. And along the way, I mean, I think what a lot of these things pointed to was really that it's less about identifying what my research interests are and more about identifying my values. So a few things that I have since kind of identified as some of my core values that inform how I approach my research are that I'm not a tech utopian, right? I don't unilaterally think that technology is a good thing. I want to work on it only to the extent that it helps people, and actively avoid working on it when it's advancing technology that has more potential to do harm. I also really, really value critique and complaint. There's one of the books, maybe I could have put on that slide, was Sarah Ahmed's book, Complaint, which is mostly about complaint within, like, how complaints are processed in institutions and the compounding of trauma that can happen as a result. But in general, like, I've been, my eyes have really been opened to this concept of, like, toxic positivity, right? I used to just think, like, oh, I shouldn't be so negative about things. I should, I should just, like, have more gratitude and like find the good in everything, right? And I admired a lot of people who did that, and still do. But at the same time, like, I kept seeing the people who were complaining about important things to complain about being shut out of conversations because of that. And then those problems, the things they were complaining about, would never get solved, uh, which is sort of what's meant by toxic positivity. So that is a thing that I value and that I think is really important. Like, talk to your fellow grad students and complain about things, like even little petty things. Talk to each other about what you don't like in your department. Talk to each other about what you wish were better. That's the only way things improve. I actually think of complaint as an idealist and optimistic thing to do, because if you're complaining, you still believe it can be better, as opposed to just being resigned to accept whatever you don't like about it. Another value of mine is resisting capitalist and colonialist assumptions, which are more pervasive in academia and computer science than I realized when I entered the field. And going along with that, some of the things that capitalist and colonialist values don't value are rest and play, both of which I have learned a lot more about and have placed a lot more value on in how I do things. And rest, by the way, is not just about, like, reclaiming your time and, like, being able to get a break from work. It's also, even if the only thing you care about is achievement and productivity, rest is how you do that. I don't know if you're kind of aware of all the research on this, but, like, you know there's I can send the name of the book if I remember it. I should have put it on the slide, but there's a book about the importance of rest in maintaining long-term productivity. That, if you to convince a boss or something, or a grad school advisor, like, might be a good reference. But it's also just important because rest is important. And play, especially when I'm working in a field that's so deeply connected to games, digital and otherwise, uh, it comes up all the time in the motivation for that work, that play is a fundamental way that humans learn and engage with the world and grow and think about things differently. And without the ability to play, it's very easy to become stagnated and to not have any new ideas, and to become depressed. So yeah, like play, I would say is the opposite of depression. So it's one of my key values in both the work that I do and the not work that I do, in the way that I take breaks from work. And finally, social interdependence, right? We talk a lot about this concept of like being self-sufficient or independent, and like self-care is part of that, right? Like you have to take care of all your needs for yourself. And I've been really inspired by, and like kind of influenced by, like a little bit of a pushback to that, which says, no, we were never meant to have to do all of this stuff alone. The idea is that we help each other, right? We all have things that we can help each other with. We all have things we can do that other people can't do, whether that's like cooking a meal or proving a theorem, right? And we have things we need that other people might do for us if they knew we needed it. So that's a strong value of mine that, yeah, I just try to be really clear on, in the way that I do everything in my life, and including in my job. Yeah, that means that means a lot of like not framing things as competitive, not framing things as like, oh, it's my research lab versus your research lab, but rather like, what are some of the ways that we can either collaborate or like share resources, so that the sum of our parts is bigger than what either of us could do alone. And then finally, some things that I wish people had told me when I was in grad school. First of all, your advisor's research methods are not the only research methods. Ask people about their research methods, basically, would be like people outside your field, how they like what their research methods are. I think you'd be surprised about the variety that exists, the diversity of them that exists. Yes, you can do research on that, and someone probably already has. Pretty much everything that you can develop a deep interest in has like a conference or a journal associated with it, and there are people out there doing research on it. And you can find them and you can talk to them, and they will probably be delighted to talk to you about their niche interests. And it's great. It's one of the things I love about the world. And well, for me specifically, it was OMG, get an ADHD evaluation. The way that might translate for some of you is like, if you have chronic problems that are affecting your life and your work, talk to other people who have those problems, and like see if they're comfortable sharing what their diagnoses are. Or just like research them more. Look into ADHD, look into autism, look into neurodivergence more generally. Even if you were told at a young age, like, oh, you don't have those things, it's very common for those sorts of things to go overlooked, particularly if you're not a cis white man. So yeah, maybe go to therapy. Think about your neurotype and your mental health. Those things are important. All right. I think I got some kind of notification. I'm not sure what it was.
Oh,
Okay,
it was
5 minutes
just
left. Got
telling
it.
you that 5 minutes.
All right. I'm almost done. So what I'm doing now, there's this adorable little John Green YouTube video about New Year's resolutions and taking it down a notch instead of taking it up a notch, which is where he is in his life. And I think that's kind of where I am in my life now as well. I'm not really sure. I have tenure. I'm in a new place. This is the second time I've gotten COVID in the last 3 months. So a lot of things have kind of been not really about like focusing on research, which is in some ways a bummer, but in other ways it's meant that I've been able to take a step back a little bit and think about like, what's the next step? What am I going to try to do in this next chapter? And I've been spending it making art, some of it for January, which is a month of generative art prompts in the month of January. Some of that work is on the slide, and looking at mushrooms and lichens, being in the outdoors, and snuggling with my cats. So it's been pretty good, all told. And that's it. I would love to take any questions you might have, and I would love to hear from you at any of these. Well, my email address is here. My website is convivial.tools, and I'm on Mastodon on the hci.social instance. And that's it. Happy to take questions.